Somewhere above the Solomon Islands, a battered B-17 flying fortress struggled to remain in the air. Two of its engines were dead. Oil streaked across the fuselage in long black lines, trailing behind the aircraft like dark scars against the sky. Hydraulic fluid leaked steadily from a ruptured line, dripping into the slipstream. Inside the bomber, 10 men listened to the uneven rhythm of the remaining engines and understood the brutal mathematics of their situation. They were alone, and they were being hunted. Above and behind them, 12 Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters circled like sharks, sensing blood in the water. The crew had already checked their ammunition. Each gunner knew exactly how much he had left. 2 attack passes, maybe 3. After that, the guns would fall silent. But the pilot of the aircraft believed he still had one advantage. Something small. Something no one else had taken seriously. Something he had noticed months earlier in the skies above the Pacific. The war in the Solomon Islands had begun only months before. On August 7, 1942, American forces landed on the island of Guadalcanal, launching the first major Allied offensive against the Japanese Empire. The island itself seemed insignificant. 40 miles of dense jungle, mud roads, malaria. But in war, geography often decides history. Whoever controlled Guadalcanal would control the shipping lanes connecting Australia and the United States. And both sides understood that clearly. For 6 savage months, ships, aircraft, and men would fight and die around that small island. At the center of the struggle stood a single airstrip, Henderson Field. Originally built by Japanese engineers, it was captured by American Marines during the landing. From that moment forward, Henderson Field became one of the most contested pieces of ground in the Pacific. Japanese bombers attacked it almost daily. American fighters rose to defend it, and every aircraft that could fly was thrown into the fight. For the crews of the U.S. Army Air Forces, the war over Guadalcanal meant something simple and terrifying. Distance. The missions were long, dangerously long. Bombers launched from scattered bases across the Pacific, Port Moresby, Espiritu Santo, New Caledonia. Each mission required flying hundreds of miles over open ocean. There were no emergency landing fields, no friendly territory. If an engine failed, if fuel ran low, if fighters intercepted them, the only landing place was the sea, and the Pacific Ocean showed little mercy to downed airmen. The B-17 flying fortress had never been designed for this environment. Its doctrine had been written with Europe in mind. Shorter distances, large bomber formations, fighter escort. In the Pacific, the aircraft was forced to adapt. It became a reconnaissance platform, a naval search aircraft, a long-range bomber striking Japanese shipping and island bases across enormous distances. The aircraft was strong. It could absorb tremendous damage. Stories circulated among aircrews of B-17s returning home with shredded wings, destroyed engines, and half their tail missing. But even the flying fortress had limits. And the greatest threat came from a fighter aircraft that had already earned a fearsome reputation. The Mitsubishi A6M0. Fast, light, deadly. In 1942, the Zero seemed almost unbeatable. American pilots had watched it dominate the skies over the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Against slow bombers flying alone, the Zero was devastating. It attacked from above, from behind, sometimes directly from the front at terrifying closing speeds. A bomber crew might see the fighter for only 3 seconds before it flashed past in a burst of gunfire. 3 seconds between life and death. Heavy bomber crews quickly developed their own traditions of survival. They named their aircraft, painted nose art, created quiet rituals before takeoff. But more importantly, they studied their enemy. Every mission ended with conversations. How did the Zeros attack? What angles did they prefer? How close did they come before breaking away? Most of this knowledge never appeared in official reports. It passed between crews through stories and observation. And sometimes a single observation could save an entire crew. First Lieutenant Robert Maxwell was the kind of man who paid attention. He had grown up in Terre Haute, Indiana, the son of a farm equipment mechanic. From childhood, he had learned that machines followed rules. If you understood how something worked, you could understand how it might fail. Maxwell carried that mindset into aviation. He joined the Army Air Corps in 1940, before the war reached America. At flight school, instructors noticed something unusual about him. Maxwell possessed extraordinary spatial awareness. He could picture the sky around him almost like a map, where other aircraft were, where clouds began, where danger might appear. It wasn't instinct. It was geometry, the mind of an engineer applied to flight. By early 1942, Maxwell was flying combat missions in the Pacific with the 43rd Bombardment Group. His crew consisted of 9 other men: a ball turret gunner from Chicago, a former mathematics teacher from Oregon, farm boys, factory workers, ordinary Americans now fighting a war over endless water. Maxwell welded them together through one simple idea. Survival is a group project. Every man watching his sector helped the others stay alive. After every mission, Maxwell asked the same questions. How did the fighters approach? What angle? How close? When did they break away? His crew joked that he was building a library inside his head. They weren't wrong, because Maxwell had begun noticing something strange about the Zeros. Something that might explain why some attacks ended early. Something that might give a bomber crew one tiny advantage in the sky. And in the Pacific War, sometimes one tiny advantage was the difference between life and death. Maxwell began treating every encounter with Japanese fighters like a problem that needed solving. After each mission, he sat down with his crew and asked the same questions. Exactly how did the fighters approach? From what direction? At what distance did they open fire? And most importantly, when did they break away? Combat was chaotic. Memories were imperfect. But Maxwell was patient. He began tracking the timing of every attack, counting the seconds between first sighting and breakoff. He compared what each gunner reported seeing from his position. Sometimes the Zeros pressed their attacks aggressively, but other times they broke away earlier than expected. The pattern was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But Maxwell noticed something important. Whenever multiple gunners fired simultaneously, the Japanese fighters often turned away sooner. Not because they were being hit, but because the sky suddenly looked dangerous. Streams of glowing tracers would converge toward the attacking fighter from several directions at once. To a pilot closing at 400 miles per hour, that sudden explosion of gunfire could look like a trap. Maxwell gave the phenomenon a name. He called it the mad dog effect. The idea was simple. A mad dog doesn't necessarily bite, but no one wants to get close enough to find out. If a bomber could suddenly fill the air with gunfire from every direction at once, not constant fire, but sudden bursts, it might create the illusion of overwhelming defense. Enough uncertainty to disrupt an attack. Enough hesitation to buy time. And in aerial combat, time meant survival. Maxwell decided to bring the idea to squadron intelligence. In November 1942, a stretch of bad weather temporarily grounded flying operations. The pause gave crews time to analyze recent missions. Maxwell approached the squadron intelligence officer with his notes. He explained the pattern he believed he had discovered. Then he proposed a new defensive technique. Instead of firing independently, the gunners would hold their fire until Maxwell gave the command. At a precise moment during the fighter's approach, every gun that could bear on the target would open fire simultaneously. The goal was not accuracy. It was visual shock. The intelligence officer listened carefully. Then he explained why the idea wouldn't work. First, bomber gunners were trained to fire as soon as they had a target. Waiting for a command would reduce their total volume of fire. Second, coordination during combat was nearly impossible. The interphone system often failed. Each gunner was isolated in his own compartment. And finally, there was no evidence that Japanese fighters broke off because they were intimidated. They broke off because they had been hit, or because they had fired their own ammunition, or because their doctrine emphasized short attacks. Maxwell thanked the officer for his time. Then he went back to his crew. That evening, after dinner, the men gathered in their tent. A lantern hung from the center pole. Maxwell drew rough diagrams on a piece of cardboard. He explained the theory. Then he explained the objections. Finally, he said something unusual. This isn't an order. If anyone wants to keep firing the way we were trained, that's fine. But if we try this together, it might save us someday. The ball turret gunner, Staff Sergeant William Kowalski, asked the obvious question. What if we're wrong? What if waiting to fire gets us killed? Maxwell answered honestly. The way we're doing it now isn't working well enough. We're losing crews. Individual shooting against fighters moving that fast is almost impossible. But if we make them think we're more dangerous than we really are, they might hesitate. And hesitation is all we need. The crew looked at each other. Then they agreed. All of them. For the next 3 weeks, whenever weather or maintenance grounded their aircraft, Maxwell's crew practiced. They developed short commands that could be transmitted quickly over the interphone. Marking. Ready. Fire. Each gunner tracked imaginary fighters through his sights. At Maxwell's command, they simulated firing bursts. Again and again, until the timing became instinct. But Maxwell knew the interphone might fail during combat, so they created backup signals. 2 heavy bangs on the aircraft fuselage meant prepare. 3 meant fire. It was improvised, unofficial, exactly the kind of battlefield adaptation that armies quietly rely upon. By mid-December, the crew was ready, or as ready as anyone could be for a technique that had never been tested in real combat. The opportunity came sooner than they expected. December 18, 1942. The mission was reconnaissance. Their aircraft, a B-17, the crew had named Hoosier Hotshot after Maxwell's home state, would photograph Japanese installations on Bougainville Island. The bomber took off from Henderson Field shortly after sunrise. The flight north was calm. Clouds floated at 8,000 feet. Visibility was excellent. Below them, the Pacific stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The photo run over Bougainville lasted 12 minutes. Then they turned south for home, and that was when the Zeros appeared. At 11:47 hours, tail gunner Corporal Antonio Reyes spotted them first. 12 fighters southeast, climbing fast. The Japanese formation rose beneath the cloud layer. They had altitude advantage. And numbers. A perfect interception. Maxwell looked at the instruments, then at the cloud bank below. 7,000 feet down. If they could reach it, they might survive. He keyed the interphone. Prepare coordinated defense. The moment they had practiced for had finally arrived, and the next few minutes would determine whether Maxwell's theory was brilliant or fatal. The Zeros were closing fast. From the tail gunner's position, Corporal Antonio Reyes watched them grow larger in the sky, their dark shapes cutting through the sunlight as they climbed toward the bomber. 12 fighters, still closing, he reported. Inside the flying fortress, the tension became almost physical. Every man knew the situation. They were alone. No escort fighters. No other bombers nearby. Just one damaged B-17 facing a dozen Japanese interceptors. Maxwell pushed the control yoke forward slightly, beginning a slow descent toward the cloud bank he had spotted earlier. 7,000 feet below them. If they could reach it, they might disappear long enough to escape. But the Zeros were faster. They would attack before the bomber reached the clouds. Maxwell did the math quickly. 2 attack passes. Maybe 3. That was all the time they needed to survive. The first wave came from behind. 3 Zeros peeled away from the formation and dove toward the bomber's high rear quarter, the classic attack position against heavy bombers. Reyes tracked the lead fighter through his gun sight. His finger rested on the trigger. Under normal doctrine, he would already be firing. But Maxwell had given a different order. Wait. The fighters closed the distance rapidly. 800 yards. 600. The distinctive shapes of the Zeros became clearer now. Long wings. Rounded engine cowling. The red Hinomaru insignia on the wings. 400 yards. Maxwell gripped the microphone. Marking. The gunners steadied their aim. Ready. 350 yards. The fighters were seconds away from opening fire. Maxwell's voice cut through the interphone. Fire. 7 machine guns erupted at once. From the ball turret beneath the bomber. From the waist gunners. From the tail. From every position that could bear on the attackers. A sudden storm of tracer fire exploded into the sky. Bright orange streaks converged toward the approaching fighters from several directions at the same instant. The effect was shocking. To the Japanese pilots, it must have looked like the bomber had suddenly transformed into a spinning fortress of gunfire. The lead Zero jerked violently left and downward. The 2 fighters behind it scattered instinctively, breaking formation. The attack dissolved. Not a single tracer round had struck them. The range had still been too great for accurate shooting. But the illusion of overwhelming firepower had worked exactly as Maxwell hoped. For a few seconds, the attackers hesitated. The Zeros regrouped quickly. Experienced pilots. They would not be fooled twice. This time the second attack came from the side. 2 fighters streaked in from the beam, aiming for the bomber's weaker lateral defenses. Maxwell watched them approach. He held his fire again. The fighters closed. 500 yards. 400. Marking. The gunners tracked them. Ready. 300 yards. Fire. The waist gunners opened up simultaneously. The radio compartment gun joined them. The top turret swung around and added its own burst. Again, the sky exploded with tracers. Again, the fighters reacted. Both Zeros snapped away from their attack paths before reaching effective firing range. For a second time, the attack dissolved into confusion. Inside the bomber, the crew felt a surge of hope. It was working, but the battle was not over. Maxwell glanced at the engine instruments. 2 engines were already running rough from mechanical problems earlier in the flight. The aircraft was losing altitude faster than planned. The cloud bank was getting closer, but so were the fighters. The third attack came from the most dangerous direction of all, directly ahead, a high frontal assault. The Zero dove toward the bomber nose first at terrifying speed. Closing velocity between the aircraft exceeded 400 miles per hour. Only one gun could face it. The nose gun. Sergeant Paul Dvorak gripped the handles of his weapon and waited. Maxwell knew he could not coordinate fire from the other gunners without risking them shooting through their own aircraft. So he improvised. At the last moment, Maxwell shoved the control column forward. The B-17 suddenly dropped its nose into a steep dive toward the clouds. The unexpected maneuver forced the attacking Zero to adjust its aim. For a split second, the Japanese pilot hesitated. Dvorak fired. Long bursts of machine gun fire streaked toward the fighter. The Zero flashed past the bomber in a blur of speed, but it had already fired. Bullets hammered into the flying fortress. The number 2 engine exploded into flames. Inside, the cockpit warning lights lit up instantly. Engine fire. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Frank Moretti, reached for the controls and began feathering the damaged propeller. Oil pressure on another engine dropped dangerously. The aircraft was now running on borrowed time, but they were almost there. At 11:53 hours, the bomber plunged into the cloud bank. White mist swallowed the aircraft completely. Visibility dropped to 0. Behind them, the Zeros raced past the cloud edge, searching for their target. But the bomber had vanished. Inside the clouds, Maxwell leveled the aircraft carefully. Navigation now depended entirely on compass headings and dead reckoning. The B-17 was badly damaged. 2 engines compromised. Hydraulic systems leaking. Dozens of bullet holes in the fuselage. But it was still flying. And most importantly, the crew was still alive. Above the clouds, 12 Japanese fighters circled in frustration. Somewhere below them, the bomber they had nearly destroyed was limping toward home. And the 60 seconds of chaos Maxwell had created with coordinated gunfire had been just enough. Just enough time to disappear. The cloud cover stretched farther than Maxwell had dared to hope. Inside the overcast, the battered B-17 Hoosier hotshot crawled south toward Guadalcanal. Visibility was nearly 0. Moisture coated the windshield and the cockpit instruments flickered in the dim gray light. Maxwell kept the aircraft steady using only the compass and his navigator's calculations. There was no room for mistakes now. 2 engines were damaged, the hydraulic system was failing, and the aircraft was losing altitude slowly but steadily. But they were still flying. And for the moment, the Japanese fighters had lost them. Behind them, somewhere above the clouds, 12 Zeros continued searching the empty sky for a bomber that had simply vanished. The flight back to Henderson Field felt longer than the entire mission north. Every sound inside the aircraft made the crew tense. A strange vibration from the wing. The uneven rhythm of the engines. The faint smell of burned oil drifting through the fuselage. Each man waited for the next failure. But the flying fortress lived up to its name. It kept flying. At 12:47 hours, nearly an hour after the interception, the damaged bomber finally broke through the cloud cover above Guadalcanal. The runway of Henderson Field appeared below them, carved from jungle mud and surrounded by sandbagged anti-aircraft positions. Ground crews watching the approach immediately understood the condition of the aircraft. One engine burned black from oil. Another spun unevenly. The landing gear lowered only halfway before locking into place with a violent shudder. Maxwell guided the bomber toward the runway carefully, holding the damaged aircraft level as long as possible. The wheels touched the ground hard. The B-17 bounced once, then settled onto the strip and rolled to a stop in a long cloud of dust. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then Maxwell shut down the engines. Silence filled the aircraft. They were alive. The crew evacuated through the top hatch because the hydraulic system had failed and the ball turret could no longer rotate. Staff Sergeant William Kowalski, trapped inside the turret, had to be pulled out through an emergency panel. The turret motor had burned out during the engagement, but he was alive. All of them were. 10 men standing on the ground, looking at a bomber that should never have made it home. Maxwell's combat report quickly attracted attention. The same intelligence officer who had dismissed his theory a month earlier now studied the document carefully. The facts were difficult to ignore. A single bomber had survived sustained attacks by 12 Japanese fighters. It had escaped long enough to reach cloud cover, and it had returned with every crew member alive. Maxwell's idea, the coordinated burst of defensive fire he had called the Mad Dog effect, appeared to have played a decisive role. Within days, the report began circulating among bomber crews of the 43rd Bombardment Group. Pilots and gunners discussed the idea during briefings and late-night conversations beside parked aircraft. The name stuck, the Mad Dog Baffle. No one could say for certain whether it truly worked. Combat offered no controlled experiments, but crews who tried the technique reported something important: a feeling of control. Instead of waiting helplessly for fighters to attack, the crew could act together at a precise moment. That moment of coordination changed everything. Because survival in combat often depended as much on confidence as on firepower. By early 1943, variations of coordinated defensive fire began appearing in mission reports throughout the Solomon Islands. Some crews used stopwatches to time their bursts. Others developed their own command sequences. A few rejected the method entirely, preferring continuous fire. But Maxwell's idea had spread, not through official doctrine, but through the most powerful network in any military. The conversations between men who had survived the same dangers. As the war continued, the situation in the Pacific began to change. New American fighter aircraft entered the battle. The P-38 Lightning, the F-6F Hellcat, the P-47 Thunderbolt. These fighters challenged Japanese air superiority and increasingly escorted American bombers on long missions. The desperate improvisations of 1942 slowly became less necessary. But the lessons remained. Observation mattered. Adaptation mattered. And sometimes the best ideas came from the men closest to the fight. Maxwell flew 12 more combat missions before malaria and exhaustion forced his evacuation to Australia in April 1943. His crew continued flying with another pilot, still using the techniques they had practiced together. Some survived the war. Some did not. Their aircraft, Hoosier Hot Shot, was eventually lost in August 1943 during a strike on Rabaul. The crew aboard that day was not Maxwell's. None survived. War rarely allows every story to end well. After returning to the United States, Maxwell spent the remainder of the war as a flight instructor in Florida, training new bomber pilots. He taught navigation, formation flying, survival, and sometimes he mentioned the Mad Dog Baffle, not as a revolutionary tactic, but as an example. Watch carefully, he told his students. Trust what you see. Sometimes the answer is already there. After the war, Maxwell returned to Terre Haute, Indiana. He took over his father's equipment repair business. He married, raised 3 children, built a quiet life far removed from the chaos of the Pacific War. He rarely spoke about combat. When people asked, he simply said he had been lucky. And luck, he believed, was not something to boast about. Decades later, in 1982, a military historian studying bomber operations in the Solomon Islands discovered Maxwell's original combat reports in the National Archives. The documents stood out immediately. Detailed, analytical, written by a pilot who had studied his enemy while under fire. The historian contacted Maxwell. By then he was 70 years old, still running the family repair shop. They exchanged letters for months. In one letter, Maxwell explained something important. The Mad Dog Baffle, he wrote, had never really been about the tactic itself. It had been about giving the crew something to do together. When everything felt hopeless, when survival seemed impossible, sometimes the illusion of control was enough to change reality. Maxwell died in 1996. His obituary mentioned his wartime service briefly. A decorated pilot, a veteran of the Pacific, a flight instructor. It did not mention the 12 zeros, or the 60 seconds that saved 10 lives in the sky above the Solomon Islands. But his crew remembered. For the rest of their lives, they told the story of the quiet pilot from Indiana who noticed something others had missed. A man who believed that careful observation could create order even in the chaos of war. And sometimes, in a war fought by millions, the attention of a single man is enough to make the difference between oblivion and another sunrise.